And then, okay. So, all right. So thank you so much for joining me. As I was telling you before, at Carpe Travel, we focus a lot on American wine regions. With all 50 states, they all produce wine. So there's a lot to go into and cover. So I'm really excited to talk to you guys, though, about the Riboli family wine collection and its San Antonio Winery in California for a couple of reasons. One, for being named Wine Enthusiast American Winery of the Year, and the fact that you guys are a family-owned and operated winery that's been producing wine for over a century. And I know that doesn't sound like a long time for people outside of the US, but in this country, that's a really long time. So I wanted to see first if you could, kind of tell us a little bit about you and your role at the Riboli family winery, and then a little bit of background on the winery itself.
Yeah, so I am the manager of marketing and brand development for our estate wines.
Well, I'm sorry, I totally didn't introduce you. So go ahead and tell us who you are and what you're
Oh
doing.
yeah, sorry. So yeah, I'm Billy Galanko, the manager of marketing and brand development for the estate wines. So the Riboli family, and the little step of what I do is the Riboli family has estates in a small estate in Napa and around over 1,500 acres in Paso Robles and Monterey County. So quite a large range of holdings, but that's mainly only in the past, 10 or so years have they been acquiring these pieces of land to own outright, and really start focusing on making their own wines from their own grapes. So I've come on exclusively to work on the estate wines as opposed to Stella Rosa, and some of the other brands that we own as a family, I guess. I'm not part of the family, but as the family goes. And so I would say a majority of the company does focus on Stella Rosa, but with the family's long heritage, as you referenced, being in making California wines and really the roots and the foundation of the company being in California, they've started pouring more resources, time, and energy into building out the wines that are based out of their own estates and the California wines. So coming on my background, I'm a certified sommelier. Became certified in New York while working in digital marketing, actually. After becoming certified, wanted to continue to explore my wine passion. I left New York and worked a harvest in Australia. So I spent the harvest as a cellar hand, getting to know really the ins and outs of the actual winemaking itself, as opposed to just blind tasting in theory. While down there, I toured every major wine region in Australia except for Western Australia and Mornington Peninsula. So it was really interesting to kind of get a sense of what New World winemaking really meant and how things are progressing, and what it truly meant to be kind of a modern player in the world of wine outside of the old world. Because as you guys know, especially in California, even the older players, as you were saying earlier, like Napa's really only been firing for a little over 50 years now. So modern day California wine is very young. There is that heritage from the early mid 1800s, and we came in soon after that. But so yeah, that's a little bit of my. So basically, I ended up coming here. I lived in LA. I had been working remotely for the Australian wine company that I had worked for, doing their digital marketing as well. But I was looking for somewhere that I could really kind of get back into the production side of things, more directly, and something that had a little bit of heritage and some estates in California. So when I first heard about the Riboli family, I came and interviewed with their fourth generation winemaker, Anthony, and he shared my passion both for the geeky side of wine, but also, his family, the estates, and all of that as well. So
Let's talk about the Riboli family for a second. So 100 years winemaking. And so, but like you said, California's only been kind of on hitting the mark for like 50 years because we had national prohibition and that kind of wiped everything out. Then you had people come back, but then we weren't really that popular. And then 50 years was really at the Judgment of Paris, where the American wine regions became, wait, we beat French wine. So, okay, this must be good again. So kind of from when they came over to the US, let's say before Prohibition, because 100 years you guys have been making wine. So can you give a little bit of context just from a historical standpoint, since we don't hear a lot about family winemakers or fourth generation family wineries for 100 years in this country and how they kind of got started that way.
Yeah, for sure. So, as you mentioned, the wine industry in California had been fledgling, and it had been growing fairly strong starting in the mid 1850s. So the first family member came here the winery started in 1917, but he came in 1915, 1916. And the interesting part is it was part of a larger Italian influx. A lot of, wineries here, the Sagacio family is still around, Gallo. These people have Italian roots. It's just we so happen the Ribolis landed in Los Angeles rather than staying up in Napa.
Which is so unique because people don't think of LA as like wine country, but if you look at it from a climate standpoint, it was the prime spot to be.
Oh yeah, so like very much so. So there's a lot of vineyard land over Pasadena, just east of here, up in the hills. There still is a fair bit of wine grown in LA County, and the really interesting part is the Spanish came, coming up from Mexico, and as they made their way up, they were planting vineyards all the way up. So there was actually some of the oldest vineyards in California are still south of LA, closer to kind of the Idlewild, a little further past in like the desert area, but it's really interesting to see what used to be here. We have some old photos of Madalena, the grandmother of, so the second generation, or she is the second generation, and her standing in head-trained Zinfandel vines that are literally just like 20-minute drive from here that are now just completely planted over, or not planted over, built over. So it was really interesting. So this was, in a heart of, not Napa, but it was very close proximity to grapes. So it didn't seem crazy to have a winery built here. And then over time, they just basically started producing what was common in the later days. So it was kind of more fine wine. You still have the licenses to make California Champagne, California Chablis, California Madeira, because we were basically licensed so long ago. And then through Prohibition, luckily the family, being Italian, had Catholic roots. So they were able to start making some sacramental wine to help get them through. And participate in some of the bulk practices that really, a lot of people don't really know about. There were some loopholes where you could create like dried grape, bricks pretty much, and then had a little packet of yeast, and you basically would send these off somewhere east and be like, you have to have like a skull and crossbones and a warning and say, don't put this with some water and pour this packet in because it might result in fermentation. So there was some of those loopholes that allowed companies like ours to keep going and really survive through Prohibition. But it was really that sacramental portion was what the company here really relied on in Southern California because everywhere else was so far north.
Yeah. There weren't a lot of wineries that lasted during Prohibition. That's really cool that you guys were able to pull that off.
So moving out after Prohibition, the company, started creating what was popular in California at the time. We were sourcing grapes throughout the state. So there was moving into some jug wine, some bulk wine. That was really what was popular at the time, but they still made, California Chablis, Velvet Chablis as it was known a little later, California Champagne, Madeiras, a lot of fortified wines at the beginning. And this is when Santo Stefano, who is kind of the patriarch who just died last year, came, or his name was just Stefano, but basically came last year, or died last year with Madalena, and they really kind of transformed the company. Stefano came and joined his uncle, who was already here, who was the first member of the family, and then they basically started trying to transform this into something more. And it was really driven by the Madalena, who was the wife, and basically the matriarch of the family, who's still alive, is about to turn 98. She basically helped drive the business into constantly evolving and looking how to innovate. So while the company was growing here, they had their big redwood vats, and they were still making wine in a very traditional manner. She opened a restaurant here in the 70s, which was the first restaurant connected to a winery in the whole state. And basically they started pushing this hospitality and tasting and really tapping into their Italian roots in ways that nobody else was doing at the time. So that's what's led us to have, one of our key brands is Madalena, still named in her honor, along with some
connected to the San Antonio Winery in LA, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Sorry. And Paso. So over time, so this is, the San Antonio, I guess I'll talk about now the wineries that we have, because so basically the winery itself here is still functioning. You can still come in the same exact door that, you used to be able to come into, but it's just grown and grown. And the interesting part is every time the family has grown the actual facility here, they reuse pieces of the past to kind of help remember. So there are multiple walls that are lined, or the floors that are lined with old redwood barrels. We have skylights from the old redwood barrels that have been repurposed, and you can look straight back up into them. We have big boti that are still here, harkening back to the Italian past, and boti are those very large barrels.
Yeah.
So it is basically, it's really interesting to see how the heritage and the innovation has not forgotten the past, but just grown upon it. And so much so, like I was saying, that's led them to, and it was Madalena's idea to buy 20 acres in Napa back in the 80s. And then over time, it was Stefano, the patriarch's vision to buy couple, at first one vineyard in Paso, and then over time it kind of expanded a lot. So at this point now we have a winery here that's still a functioning winery where all of our wines are bottled and the whites are fermented. And then up in Paso we have a state-of-the-art winery that's basically where all the reds are fermented. They still come down here and are bottled, but it's 100% sustainable, powered by solar panels. We have water treatment, basically reclaiming all the water to be used either back in the winery or in the vineyards. And yeah, this goes back to kind of what I was hearkening at with the Australia time. Is I was there at a quote unquote modern winery, and then after going up here and seeing this Paso winery that's basically so innovative in both sustainability and the efficiencies of not needing that many people to run it, it's really a sight to behold.
So then you have 3 wineries then, right? Paso, LA, and no, it was just 2.
Just 2. So the San Antonio Winery of Los Angeles is based here. There's a tasting room out in Ontario. Okay. But basically we have a tasting room in Ontario, a tasting room and a winery here, and then we have our winery and tasting room up in Paso.
Okay. So what's the rationale for all of the locations? I mean, I understand all of the wine, all the vineyards. That totally makes sense for diversification and different grape varietals that you can grow. But the locations, what was kind of the rationale for, clearly the original one in LA, but then the other tasting rooms as well?
Mm-hmm. So the winery obviously was founded here, but as we mentioned before, there were vines out further east. There's a big population center, and LA, the kind of center of population has always kind of shifted. So the family saw, and as they pushed more into the hospitality side of things, they saw more opportunity to kind of have a base and a hospitality foothold out in Ontario. So that way you could have people coming from further west stop here. If people were coming in from the east or living out in Pasadena, they wouldn't have to come all the way in to Los Angeles before the highways, and to be honest with the traffic too, it was easier to actually have a touch point. Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah. So, but then it's just the Paso establishment that's really like kind of the sustainable facility, or the others as well?
The Paso is 100% sustainable. Here in LA, we are progressing to becoming 100% sustainable. We have solar panels on the roof now. We're working on the other elements of reclamation, but the winery itself is not quite there. But all of our vineyards, even the one in Napa, are sustainable.
How are you guys doing it out in the vines? Because that's really what matters, is the agricultural element of how you're growing sustainably, because that's where it really makes the biggest impact.
Exactly. And that's to be honest, and Anthony will tell you, a fourth generation winemaker, that's the biggest thing that's improved the quality of the wine in the past 10 years. Is before, even if you have a long-term partnership with someone, they get the final say on whether whether you use fertilizers or not, how you water, how you irrigate, if you drop fruit. And now owning our own vineyards, we're really able to, calibrate what we put in the soil, how much we water, and basically really take care of the lands. And we've seen the more that we've been able to be stewards, even vineyards that we had been using before but weren't managing ourselves, the quality of the wine from all of those has just drastically increased.
You guys, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like I saw that you guys had some sustainability certifications. Am I right with that, or am I missing? Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, are you guys? Yeah. So you're certified sustainable, but are you also like certified organic, or do you do biodynamic too?
No, not at the moment. So we're certified sustainable with the CSWA, California Sustainable Winery Association, I believe. I can follow up with that exact name, but yeah. So we're progressing towards more and more natural, fertilizers and such. So maybe closer to an organic way. I don't think we'll ever go so far as a biodynamic, with the moon and
I know.
some of the cow horns and the
I
dirt
know.
and
I
stuff.
kind of find it hard to wrap my arms around the whole biodynamic role of
Yeah, I
winemaking.
mean, I've heard great things and it works well, but we're trying to. They're large, but they're sustainably farmed to the point where we'll be able to scale and produce quality wines,
Yeah.
at 50,000, 100,000 plus cases. So being able to produce quality wines at that scale, it's just not as feasible right now to do such, in literally in the weeds kind of stuff. But it's our goal to maybe be able to bring continual quality and this consistency of sustainability, where most people, when they start claiming this, maybe one or two vineyards are, but then they buy fruit from elsewhere to be able to fill out the rest of the volume.
Right, right, right.
So our goal is to be able to scale.
So let's talk about 2020 and it being like a total lost year. Um, just because of COVID and now looking at all the fires in California, I'm hearing different things from different areas in California that, oh, some people are so excited about the vintage of 2020. Other people are saying it's a lost vintage. With you guys having vineyards in Monterey, Napa, and Paso, you kind of can diversify, but were you guys impacted by the fires? And, if so, is rosé going to be like the big thing?
If only. No, we were lucky, I will say. We had have some impact. So our property in Napa didn't necessarily get directly impacted by the smoke, but we were unable to pick at the time. I mean, there was smoke taint, but basically it was to the point where we weren't able to pick. So that was a loss this year, and we've had some impacts in the far western side of Monterey and our Santa Lucia Highlands property. That's awesome smoke impact. So unfortunately, we'll probably see a little hit on some of our top wines, some of our Pinots. Some of the most delicate skins, and they're the
Yeah.
most easily impacted. But our Paso properties, lucky, held on strong, and a lot of our Monterey properties that were a little further east also came out nice and clean. So the fruit that we have had, it was a lighter harvest, but it's looking good. So we're pretty excited, and we feel very lucky compared to a lot of the wineries,
Yeah.
especially the ones up north.
Good. All right. So it's not a total lost vintage for you. So that's good.
Oh, not at all. Yeah.
That's good. So then tell me, I'm just looking at some of my questions. So, okay, you guys have like 20 brands. And we talked a little bit about, the Stella Rosa, but that's kind of what I'm interested in the San Antonio Winery, specifically the wines coming from, or I'm sorry, it's,
You'd say Riboli family
yeah,
wines if you would like.
yeah.
That's what we're transitioning towards.
Oh, okay. So everything's going to be Riboli family wines instead of breaking it out into each brand?
Well, we're working this way, yeah. So like my specific division is the Riboli Estate Wines Group.
Okay.
So basically now we're going to transition. It's basically the whole family is going to eventually just be called Riboli Family Wines because that'll just make things easier.
Yeah,
And
because
then
I was
we're going
reading through it and I'm like, oh my gosh, which ones are they?
right. And then
Okay.
we're going to focus, we'll differentiate underneath of the Riboli Estates Group, brands that only come from our own fruit. Then we'll have kind of a core group that is brands that we do sell or own under the family label that we don't necessarily, they're not from California,
Right.
or if they are, they're not from our own estates. And then the one like Stella Rosa, who, we
Right.
import
Yeah,
from
so
them.
now do you guys own the vineyards in Italy for Stella Rosa?
No, so we do not, but we have long-term contracts and basically work with so many small producers and winemakers there that it's basically like a town is a Stella Rosa town. But yeah, it's very interesting how it's kind of blossomed and kind of grown and started to encompass like a whole little town there.
I think it's a fun way for you guys to be bringing Italian wines in, just because, especially from a lot of the small vineyards in Italy, because there's no way they could get their wines into the U.S. And so for a larger company to be able to be working with them and bringing in their grapes and making their wines under the brand, I think that's great for
Oh
them.
yeah, yeah, and it's really nice because it's heritage. The family Maddalena is
Yeah.
from Asti and Piemonte, where we source the grapes, and then rather than selling off to a co-op, they're able to kind of be part of something larger, and we take good care of all of
Yeah.
our partners. So
Yeah, and yeah, the fact that it's an Italian family heritage, I love it. That's awesome. That's a good part of the story for sure.
Mhm.
So okay, as a Psalm, I just want to talk to you about what are some of the misconceptions about wine that drive you crazy?
In general, or
Yeah,
about
just in
Riboli
general,
families?
not about the Riboli family wines, but just in general. I always
Um,
find it fun to ask people that.
I would say the first one is that all Rieslings are overly sweet. I know that's just a personal pet peeve because I'm a fan of a nice balanced Riesling.
Mhm.
Um, I could go on. I guess I would say the other one is what does dry mean? A lot of people say I only like dry wines and have very little conception of what that means in like the actual terminology. I heard somebody recently say I like dry wines. I hate Chardonnay. I like dry wines, and it's just like okay. So I think one of my I call it a pet peeve, but also my personal mission is more of like an educational mission to kind
Yeah.
of like explain to people and have them. Because once I came from being a sommelier from little wine background, and I basically just started studying, so I kind of can understand his point of view, and I tried telling like my friends and parents from a very simplistic point of view how you can what makes up a good wine, what are the building blocks. So those are my pet peeves just because I feel bad for those people, but I do think there's a nice route to be able to be like, hey, you're just tasting like some sweet oak or some overly oak thing or something that's really high in alcohol and you're perceiving it as sugar.
Yeah.
When it's technically dry, and just keep asking for more dry, you're not going to get something else you like more. Um, and I would also say regional bias. I have a thing for what I call unsung vines. So I think, one of the reasons I love working for the Riboli family is like I believe Paso Robles produces really interesting wines.
Mhm.
I also believe you don't have to just produce wines from Cabernet Sauvignon all the time, even though we have a bunch. But Anthony is planted. We have some Tanat coming up. We have
I love
obviously,
Tanat. It's so good.
yeah, and then some expressions coming out of Paso are going to be really interesting. We have some Malbec, some Mourvedre, single varietal Grenache, some Cab Franc coming up. He planted a grape most people call Mexican Nebbiolo, but it's really like a varietal of Lambrusco.
Huh.
He could tell you the exact one, but there was a whole Italian shipment that came to Mexico at one point. The boxes they were in kind of broke down, so they basically just shipped all these vines up to the Valle de Guadalupe, and nobody knew exactly what they were, and now they just call them Mexican Nebbiolo for the most part.
So do
So
you feel like when in your tasting room and even like elsewhere, you see kind of like you had said, regional bias, but what about varietal bias? Because I feel like a lot of people don't know what a Tannat is. They don't know what Mourvedre is or Pinotage. And I'm like, oh my gosh, they're fabulous. You need to try them. And half the time at restaurants, they're less expensive, but people won't do that. They'll go straight towards, a cab that they know will, a cab from Napa because that's safe. What would be kind of your
yeah,
advice on that?
yeah. So that's another personal mission. I'm kind of working on the side to kind of work on what I'm calling unsung vines as well. But yeah, I think there's not only a bias towards varietal, but that's been perpetuated by so many critics of like certain styles. So like cab can only be like this. Like for example, I had a Napa cab last night, but also one from Coonawarra, and it's like even the expressions can be so different. So I don't like when people have had one type of a varietal and they're just like, this is, I don't like the whole varietal. So it's really interesting to have, and then the way that we only have been focusing on 5 or 6 varietals throughout the world. Um, I think it's kind of a shame, but it's just the way that people are, slowly coming around. And I do think it's part of a good progression, though, because if you look back in time when everything was named after a place, that
Yeah,
was even more confusing. So at least now people are knowing to ask for certain grapes, and then it's easier for me to tell you try this other grape rather than this grape, rather than explain to you that Chablis is a place in France that has Chardonnay, and
it's
this
not
is
a grape,
also a Chardonnay. Yeah, not a grape, but this is also a Chardonnay. So
right?
I think it's progress, and I do see a lot of people coming around drinking more and more interesting things. There's a big natural wine scene here in LA that I've kind of been in and out of. My girlfriend's a huge fan, so it's been really interesting to see the obscure varietals, even like that are just popping up. Even in Santa Barbara, you're seeing
Yeah,
Gruner Veltliner
yeah.
planted more. I mean, Viognier is becoming more and more common in everybody's vernacular, but I still think that's a slightly more obscure grape. Like most
Yeah.
people wouldn't know where Condrieu was, even though it's the most like, famous Viognier in the world.
Right.
Um, so I do think I'm on a personal mission to introduce my friends to lesser known varietals. I just had a tasting the other day with, uh, it was an Austrian one, so we had some Grüners, but some Blaufränkisch and Zweigelt as well, which are also being grown on the West Coast here. So
Yeah.
I'm right with you, and I think the family here also is really interested in kind of pursuing and sharing what can be made not only from Paso but out of these different varietals. So,
That's awesome. It's good diversification as well. So
mhm.
diversify that wine portfolio.
Oh yeah.
So I'm just looking, and I think I've kind of asked you most of my questions, and we did touch a little bit on, the regional bias, but since we can't travel, or I can't, I'm not traveling right now because COVID and I hurt my back, but, um, one of the things I've been doing is tasting new regions just through wine and doing like local wine pairings at home, to just kind of scratch that itch. But why do you think, visiting a region is different than, doing what I'm doing at home? I mean, I have my own opinion, but I'd love to hear what you think too.
Yeah, no, I would say it's two or three fold. The first fold is one, just the sense of place. I know it's kind of a cliche saying, but we were recently up taking photos in one of our vineyards, and just being able to. So we say like Paso Robles has one of the few limestone kind of heavy soils in all of California.
Mm.
And it's one thing to say that and say that it was an old ocean that used to cover the land, but going up there and just being able to pick up the pieces of limestone from the earth, feeling the cool breezes that come in at nighttime, but also the heat that's there during the day, you really get to understand the forces that make the grapes, or the wine that you're tasting. To me, that goes a long way. And then it's also just the people. Being able to see the passion in the winemakers, being able to see kind of the facilities, and just the energy that's going into making these wines. Like, I think something that makes wine so amazing is not, aside from the terroir, it's the stories that go into it as well. So when you can go there and meet the people and see the passion in their eyes, or understand why their wine is shifted, or what's something new they're trying, hearing about the new, amphora that they're trying in the back, they're burying in the ground like a Georgian winemaker, even though all their main wines are made from barrels. It's really interesting, and I think that drives you to appreciate wines that you may not necessarily enjoy. Not like you don't enjoy it, but say this isn't my favorite wine in the whole world, but you know so much about it, the story of the place, and it really makes that wine an experience that you will remember more than some really sugary thing that you just really enjoyed the flavor of. So
Perfect. I couldn't agree more. I love
yeah.
it. Well,
Um,
cool. Well, thank you. If you have anything else you want to share about the wines or about the winery, definitely let me know. Otherwise,
yeah, no, I would just say that, um, in the wines themselves, we have a wide range. And that what's interesting is the Riboli family, at least before I started, and even friends in LA, they have a misconception that it's either only Stella or only old school styles or only a certain price point. We have wines, estate grown wines ranging from $13 and $15 all the way up through, $80 and $100. And the blends are very interesting. Like I was saying before, we have mid-range single varietals of Mourvedre, Malbec, so Zinfandel in that range, and then all the way down to a really great estate cab that's only like $15. So it's really interesting just to kind of see the range that the Riboli family has and how distinct each brand is, and there's something for everyone. So I think that's one of my favorite parts about working here, and then also the really openness to innovation and looking forward and trying new things. So with all these new varietals and um, just winemaking capabilities we have, especially with the new facility, it's going to be really interesting to see. A lot of our vineyards have only been finished planting this year or last year, so the fruit that we're going to have to share with everyone isn't even going to come on the market for another 2 years. So it's really interesting to see. People are just finding out about us now, and then 2 or 3 years, there's going to see so much more. There's going to be more evolution. There's always going to be new things coming. So
oh, well,
it's an exciting time.
I'm excited to taste them in a couple of years too. I've enjoyed the ones that I've already been sipping. So thank you.
Oh yeah, stay tuned for more. Yeah.
Okay, cool. I am going to pause